An original podcast from podlatino.com.
There is something that happens in cities when the sun goes down and the lights come on almost all at once. A simultaneous flash, millions of points of light appearing as if someone had flipped an invisible switch. From an airplane, it looks like magic. From the street, it is so ordinary that nobody notices anymore. But that ordinariness took hundreds of thousands of years to build, and it was the result of a chain of discoveries, mistakes, ambitions, and accidents that permanently transformed the relationship between human beings and darkness. For most of human history, night was a real boundary. Not a metaphor, not an inconvenience. A physical limit that determined what could be done and what could not. When the sun disappeared, the world became dangerous, cold, and above all, dark. Activities that required vision, which was nearly all of them, were suspended until dawn. Life was organized around sunlight, with a precision that is hard to imagine today. Rise with the early light. Work while there was clarity. Pull back when the sky closed. The circadian rhythm was not a wellness trend. It was the only option available. Fire changed that, though modestly at first. For at least 400,000 years, human beings had controlled fire well enough to use it inside enclosed spaces. But a hearth fire did not illuminate in any practical sense. It warmed, it cooked, it kept animals away, and it created a particular social atmosphere. But its light was irregular, diffuse, and hard to direct. To illuminate with intention, to read or work with your hands, something more portable and controllable was needed. The first solutions were surprisingly clever. Oil lamps appeared at different points around the world tens of thousands of years ago, built on a simple logic. A porous wick absorbs oil and carries it toward a flame, which consumes the fuel slowly and steadily. The Greeks and Romans refined this principle using clay and bronze vessels, burning olive oil as their primary fuel. It was not a brilliant light, but it was enough to extend the useful hours of the day by several minutes, or even a few hours, depending on how much oil was available and how many lamps a household could afford. Candles came later, though the principle was similar. Wax or tallow surrounded a wick that burned more cleanly and predictably than open oil. For centuries, candles were the clearest symbol of the divide between those who could afford to light the night and those who could not. Beeswax was expensive and scarce. Animal tallow was more accessible, but produced smoke and odor. The candle industry was for a long time a strategic business, regulated by guilds and monitored by states. Whoever controlled nighttime illumination also controlled, to some degree, the productivity and leisure time of the population. Even with lamps and candles, though, lighting was a relative luxury. Medieval European cities were fundamentally dark places after sundown. Streets had no public lighting, and going out at night meant carrying your own light or accepting real risk. Many cities had regulations prohibiting people from moving through the streets without a lantern past a certain hour, not so much for moral reasons, but for practical ones. Darkness sheltered thieves, hid the unevenness of the ground, and made it impossible to recognize faces. The urban night was, in essence, hostile territory. The first systematic attempt to light the streets of a city came in the 17th century, in Paris. In 1667, under the reign of Louis XIV and the administration of Lieutenant General of Police Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, thousands of oil lanterns were installed throughout the French capital. They were not bright or efficient, but they represented a radical conceptual shift. The city had decided that darkness was a collective problem that deserved a collective solution. Other European cities followed in the decades after. Amsterdam London, and Madrid adopted similar systems, with variations in lamp design and financing, but with the same underlying idea. The lit street was an extension of public space, and the state bore responsibility for it. What transformed everything more deeply was gas. In the early 19th century, the Scottish engineer William Murdoch had been experimenting with gas produced by burning coal and discovered that it could be distributed through pipes and burned in a controlled way inside lanterns. In 1807, the first streets of London were lit by gas, and the effect was so striking that people came out to watch, as if it were a spectacle. Gaslight was far brighter and more stable than candles or oil. It did not flicker in the wind, it did not go out in the rain, and it could be turned on and off with relative ease. The adoption of gas transformed cities in ways that went far beyond illumination. Theaters could offer evening performances with greater regularity and comfort. Shops could stay open past sundown. Cafes and restaurants flourished as spaces for nighttime social life. Urban life began to expand into hours that had previously belonged to sleep. This did not happen uniformly or immediately, and the early years of gas also brought accidents, explosions, and technical problems that made many people hesitant. But the direction was clear. Gas distribution networks required substantial infrastructure: pipes beneath the streets, production plants, pressure systems, and ongoing maintenance. Building that infrastructure was costly and slow, and for several decades gas remained primarily an urban phenomenon in the largest European and North American cities. Smaller towns and rural areas continued to depend on oil or candles. The gap between the illuminated nights of the great cities and the darkness of the countryside became more visible than ever. And then came electricity. More precisely, came the incandescent bulb, which was not invented by a single person at a single moment, even though the popular version of history has compressed that process into the figure of Thomas Edison. Edison was important, without question, but what he did was develop a complete system. Not just a bulb that worked in a practical and durable way, but all the infrastructure needed to deliver electrical current to homes and businesses. In 1882, his Pearl Street power station in Manhattan began supplying electricity to the first customers on the grid. It was a demonstration of engineering and business vision at the same time. What followed was one of the most accelerated transformations in the history of technology. Electricity was cleaner than gas, safer than open flames, easier to install indoors, and above all, more flexible. It could be used to illuminate, but also to run motors, refrigerate food, or transmit information. The cities that adopted the electrical system did not just change how they were lit, they changed how they functioned. Factories could operate at night with genuine efficiency, public transit could extend its hours, hospitals could perform surgery at any hour of the day. The impact on human rhythms was profound and in some ways unsettling. For millennia, human biology had co-evolved with cycles of light and darkness. The body regulated sleep, temperature, and hormone production according to sunlight. When the darkness of night began to disappear, at least in urban environments, that regulation became more complicated. Night work shifted from being an exception to being a permanent fixture in many industries. Entertainment colonized the early morning hours. Sleep began to fragment and shrink in ways that doctors in the 20th century would take decades to fully understand. At the same time, artificial light made possible forms of life that had previously been unimaginable. Reading without depending on the sun. Working with precision when the world outside was completely black. Creating art in studios lit at any hour. Photography, cinema, advertising in public spaces at night. All of these are direct consequences of the availability of stable and powerful artificial light. The cities that today seem to never sleep, with their glowing signs, their lit storefronts, and their ever-present screens, are the result of a process that began with someone placing a wick in a vessel of animal oil tens of thousands of years ago. Today, genuine darkness is hard to find in much of the world. Satellites that photograph the Earth at night show continents lit up, with bright clusters where the population concentrates and faint glimmers where some open land remains. Light pollution is now discussed as an environmental problem because artificial light affects the cycles of animals that, unlike humans, never manage to adapt to its consequences. The stars, which throughout all of human history were a constant presence in the night sky, have disappeared for an enormous portion of humanity, erased not by clouds, but by the glow of cities themselves. There is something revealing in that detail. Artificial light, which for centuries was a symbol of progress and civilization, now produces a different kind of darkness, a sky that can no longer be seen. What was gained in useful hours, in safety, in productivity, and in cultural possibility was paid for with something that few earlier generations could have imagined losing. The night is still there, but covered over. And the chain of decisions that led to that outcome began with someone who, a very long time ago, decided they were not going to let the dark tell them when to stop.